Good evening, I'm Forrest Kingfisher. I'm pleased to present the data analysis project which tests the correlation between population age and national economic growth as presented by Peter Zeihan in his 2022 book, The End of the World is Just the Beginning. The author, Peter Zeihan, is an American geopolitical strategist who owns a consulting company in Texas. Unfortunately, there aren't further details about his qualifications, and his book is light on data analysis and math, so I thought I'd do some of the analysis myself to consider as initial hypotheses. And these are: a central factor in every growth story that accompanies industrialization is that much of economic growth comes from a swelling population. And two, most of the spending a person does occurs between the ages of 15 and 45. That's the life window when people are buying cars and homes and raising children and seeking higher education. Such consumption-led activity is what drives an economy forward. In the discussion that surrounds these two succinct statements, Zeihan posits that aging population is a portent of economic ruin on a national scale, while a youthful population was a sure sign of economic growth ahead. While Zeihan doesn't provide the analysis, he does hold up post-World War II Italy versus contemporary Italy as a prime example of his thesis. In 1948, the United States instated the Marshall Plan, which was an economic recovery plan for Europe, including Italy, wherein Europeans are provided easy access to American goods, which, to be fair, Europeans are very interested in buying after the war, in exchange for shutting out goods from the Soviet Union and joining the NATO military alliance to oppose whomever the United States opposed. In this process, Italy not only recovered, but thrived economically. Gathering my data from the World Bank, Italy from 1960 to 2007 was an economic success story, shown here as rising per capita GDP, meaning more money or value per Italian citizen consistently in the post-war era. For comparison, I had the US and China's GDP per capita in the same period, and we see the overwhelming success of the United States and the slow growth of the Chinese economy. In this way, Zeihan's example matches the data. Italy was a growth economy during this era. Given that Italy grew, Zeihan suggests the population pyramid like Italy's in 1950, pictured here, with a number of people whose age presented as each layer, youngest at the bottom and oldest at the top, was ideal for economic growth. I checked this against the UN population division chart, and they match. In terms of analysis, the higher mean population age, the higher average longevity of a population, because one person who is 100 years old has equal weight and mean age as 100 people who are 1 year old. The lower the median population age, the younger age of the population, because half of the population in numbers are aged below the median, half are aged above. Italy in 950 was skewed towards the older ages. A swelling younger population with greater longevity, which is typical of an industrializing society, results in this positively skewed pyramid distribution. This, Zeihan hypothesized, as a primary determinant of economic growth. Now, I'll probably get dinged here for having two scientific charts, but both of these appear in Zeihan's book, and he's a New York Times bestseller, so I wager most people can handle the population graphs. Presented here in contrast, Italy in 2020 is an inverted pyramid. The mean and median ages are nearly the same, so there are as many people in Italy over the age of about 45 as there are people younger than 45. The mean is higher, and the distribution is slightly skewed towards younger ages, so longevity has likely stabilized. Zeihan suggests this distribution is a sign of economic stagnation or decline, though he does not provide any evidence of this, as Italian economic growth data past 2020 isn't readily available. Without data, he cites a few examples, such as Venezuela, Zimbabwe, Russia, and Japan, of nations in history whose population inverted and an economic decline followed. The only problem with a few anecdotal examples is that they do not demonstrate even a correlation between population, age, and economic activity. This is where I come in. Now, to quickly check my data gathered from the World Bank and the United Nations Population Division, population growth in an individual year should not correlate to GDP growth in the same year nor any individual year following, primarily because individual data points don't show trends. Unless there is some direct reason a baby born would generate more economic growth, the correlation shouldn't appear like it does in industrial settings where changing machines or method has a direct relationship with how an industrial process operates. Reassuringly, the data demonstrates no correlation between population growth and GDP per capita. A supportable conclusion is that a stable or shrinking population historically has as much a chance to experience growth as a growing one, because population growth has no linear relationship with economic growth. The coefficient of determination, R squared, is so small that GDP predictions for a given year have nothing to do with population growth for any other individual year. So, how do we get around this? Well, we look at 30-year spans. The average population growth over 30 years is significant to determining economic growth over 30 years, if only by 1.2%. This linear relationship exists, even if it is small. But the trend shows that lower, even negative average population growth on the left yields more economic growth, not less. So we may say Zeihan's first hypothesis is false. Population growth might be significant to every economic growth story, but the relationship is inverted. So slow-growing, stable, and shrinking populations have a higher growth per capita than rapidly growing ones. This makes some sense, as per capita ratios can rise either by economic growth rising in the numerator or smaller populations going down in the denominator. So where is he coming up with this? Well, turning to the second hypothesis regarding population age, Zeihan strongly implies that growth is really only possible for populations that are growing faster than they are aging. He suggests that if you study the fastest growth periods in any country's history, you will find that their populations are growing by a generation of lots of young people. Some common advice you might hear from relatives and friends is to figure out what the successful people are doing and do that to succeed. At this suggestion, we can determine the average per capita growth over 30-year periods for every country in the last 60 years and partition out those with above average growth. From the World Bank data, this is countries during 30-year periods whose GDP per capita growth percentage was above 6.4% mean growth rate. Following Zeihan's logic, we can look at the median age of the populations at the outset of these average 30-year growth periods and determine that, yes, the populations were overwhelmingly younger. The crosshatched bars between 15 and 19 comprise over half the top-performing 30-year performance periods of all average performers. We might conclude that the lower population age correlates to above-average performance, were it not that the case that lower population age was higher in all periods regardless of performance. By comparing the demographics of the above-average performers and the demographics of the whole population of data, all performers have higher proportion of younger populations, not just the above-average performers. The high-performance partition resembles a random sample from the whole population, even though it isn't random. So there is no inferred causation between younger age population and higher performance. By analysis of variance, the median age of a country at the outset of any 30-year period is significantly correlated to population growth. The R squared is just 0.013, meaning only about 1.3% of the growth can be attributed to the median age, but it exists. However, here we see again that older populations tend to correlate to 30-year periods with higher average economic growth. This data also doesn't support Zeihan's hypothesis that a person's economic activity is somehow greater during the early adulthood. Finally, we can examine the skew of the population's age demographic by looking at the difference between mean and median ages of a country's population at the beginning of any 30-year period and measuring its correlation to the average growth of GDP per capita over the next 30 years. As you may recall from the Italian example, Italy in 1950 had a mean minus median age of -3. So the population age was skewed towards greater age. A large number of young people were growing up during the period and longevity was increasing. If Zeihan's hypothesis were at all correct, we would expect a negative skew to correlate to a greater growth. First, the mean minus median is significant. And finally, we have some evidence at last to support Zeihan's hypotheses. An older skewed population does correlate to higher average GDP growth per 30 years. However, with an R-squared value of 0.005, the skew is far less deterministic value than either the median age or population growth. So I think Zeihan may have overvalued skew in his analysis, which is why our older and shrinking populations show more per capita growth despite the skew factor. So there's a lot of their analysis to do that I could not fit into these 10 minutes. So if you'd like to look at the raw data, you can find it in these free resources available on the internet. Thank you, and have a great day.